Okay, enough of all that. Today I'm going to be talking about something that is not always a happy subject, and I hesitated a little bit to do this, and I'm questioning myself about how to do it, but I think it's necessary to do it. And it's, I call it Long Shadows, a long narrative of sadness and tragedy tested by the public documentary record. It turns out that we all know, I'm sure, from maybe personal experience, maybe not, that some events in family lives have very long effects over time, sometimes beyond one generation, even to multiple generations. And sometimes those things don't get talked about, sometimes they're never mentioned, and yet they have big impacts. So I think it's kind of an important thing to, as sensitive as the subject can be, to talk about it sometimes with a little bit of clinical seriousness and see if we might understand it better and so on. So next slide, please. I'd like to introduce the subject by giving you a little bit about my motivation. One of my motivations for doing this is I have a personal family experience that reminds me that what I just said is true. My grandfather, my mother's father, before I was born, took his life. I'll talk about that a little later. The second reason, my second motivation, was I think of myself as a student of families, not just the history of families, but the dynamics of families. And I know that it's a serious subject by why some things happen in families, and I'm curious about looking at it historically and seeing if we can learn more about the dynamics. And thirdly, I found out these facts because I was setting out to preserve the history of an old Dartmouth house, the house at 197 Horseneck Road. And I was doing that as part of the Historic Commission. Jim McBratney owns that house, and he has suggested he'd like to demolish the house. And he is right now on a 6-month hold while we try to learn more about it and preserve its history. So next slide, please. Back to my family experience. My grandfather worked at the Wamsutta Club, and one time before I was born, before my mother was married, but she was a teenager, he came to work one day and went into the kitchen and blocked up all the windows and the doors, wrote a note, turned on the gas and lay down and killed himself. And it was front page news, and it created havoc in his family, of course. His wife had a house that was mortgaged. This was in the early 30s, and she lost the house. And my grandmother was forever a sad woman as a result of this event. She wasn't sad every day, every minute, but she went through periods. Likewise, my mother and my aunt, who was a young girl, like 10 years old when it happened, had nervous breakdown when she was a little girl and was a nervous wreck the rest of her life. She did have a life and a family and everything, but it lasted. And those of us who were the children of these children who suffered their father's death that way were affected by their attitude and their periods of sadness and so on. So it's a serious subject. Suicide is a serious subject. And as much as we don't like to talk about it all the time, we should know more about it. It might help us to prevent it sometimes if there's something we can learn. Okay, next slide, please. My mother got married in 35, early 35. So I was 3 years old when I started. My memory goes back to about when I was 3. And I remember my whole life this affecting people. Okay, next slide, please. Cast a long shadow. That's where the shadow comes from. There's a long effect of this. Now, second reason, as an avid student of genealogy and family history, I think I qualify for avid, hopefully by your definition. I really would like to understand more about this. It's much more frequent than people realize, and you'll see in the rest of this tale that it is. So I was actually in the process of learning about this old house when I stumbled over all these facts, and I saw that they told a story, and I'd like to share some of that story with you. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, the tale. When I search for the history of an old house, I try to use documentary evidence. I dig up facts as much as I can find documentary facts, and then I try to piece them together like a great big jigsaw puzzle and turn it over and see if it tells the story, if I get the pieces fitting together right. And I set out trying to learn about the house at 197 Horseneck Road, and we're fortunate that we have some people here in the audience who actually lived in that house. And I hope they can add to my story or confirm some of it or refute some of it, because historians want to get it right. I'm not proud of the fact that I discovered this. If I'm wrong, I want to know. Please don't hesitate. If you think I'm wrong, tell me I'm wrong. Because historians really want to know the truth. That's what it's about, writing the story truthfully. Okay, next slide, please. That's the house a few years ago. It looks like a pretty innocuous house from the street. And you'll notice it's called the C. Reed House. Reed, comma C, C stands for Corey Reed. That's actually a guy's middle name. William Corey Reed was the father of a guy named James Reed, who's also associated with this house and with this story. Next slide, please. One of the ways I sometimes begin these kinds of studies is I get some of the old maps that we have on our website, by the way, and we look up the house on the map, and if we think we've located the house, we see if there's any name associated with the house. Now, these maps don't necessarily record the owner of the house. They record the resident of the house when the map maker made the house. And that's a very important thing to keep in mind, because some of the problems we've had in doing this searching are explained by I think are explained by that fact. As a matter of fact, in the early stages of this study, I believed the house that is known to me now as the Benjamin Head House, which was at 133 Horseneck Road. I thought that was the 197 Horseneck Road house. It wasn't. But I've got lots of research about 133 Horseneck Road, which I will publish later. And that's also almost as interesting as this one, but not quite. Next slide, please. So we'll start out with the most recent of these residential maps. And this is the 1895 map, and that's on our website. And I've taken a small piece of this map and I'll put it up for you to look at. Now, one of my questions, and I'll ask for your help because this is where I got confused. This is the house that I now think is 133. This is the James A. Reed house, and this is the that says Barker Estate house. I believe that 197 is one of these down here, but I'm not sure which one. And if anybody wants to volunteer that they think they know which one, that's fine. But it's a little difficult. There are more maps, so we got more maps. In any case, the data that I have is about one or the other of these houses. I'm not sure which one in all cases. Next slide, please. So this is a little older map, 1871. And now we contend with the problems that map makers don't always get things right. I know that this is a guy named Barker, not Parker. But and I know he's not a Barker from Plymouth Colony, he's from Rhode Island. And I know a lot about him and his family, and as a matter of fact, he's one of the stories that's one of the tragic stories we'll talk about a little later. C. Reed is Corey Reed, James Reed's father, who at one time, and I'll jump ahead a little bit, at one time was living in the house of S. Barker. And we'll see on the next slide. By the way, Head's house is here, and Wardell, they shared the house, two people, and they owned it jointly. And so it's there. Next slide, please.
What's the 614?
I'm sorry?
The house next to Parker House.
This one?
614, what's that?
That's an elevation, I think. That's a map maker's
For
sign.
road distances, they're measuring from one corner to another.
Oh, okay.
Probably in terms of rods.
Oh, rods.
Have they measured from up at Russell's Mills down to the intersection?
Yeah, how many rods from Russell's Mills?
Yeah.
Okay, because in the deeds, we'll jump around. I'm not uncomfortable. I don't have a script, you notice. So we can jump around. But in many of the deeds, the house that I'm going to be talking about, that I'm talking about, is described in the deeds as 1 mile south of the village. So if anybody has measured all this, if that's a mile, that's the house. I'm quite sure it's not the Head house, but I think it might be one of these two. I'm not sure. In an older map, there's a house on both sides of the road. There's one here and one further down. Next map, please. This is 1850, and notice we keep going back in time. These are all on our website. Now, this is the S. Barker house right there, see it? Nothing else showing. The Head house is up here. Damages Mountain, you know that name, right? Everybody knows that name.
So which is the Head house, Bob?
The Head house is B. Slocum, right there, 133.
So that's Hope and Ruth Atkinson's?
I'm not sure who lives there now.
Is there a house on the other side of this? Yeah, there's a little key.
Yeah, it's 130. It's currently 133. Next slide, please. Now here's 1856, 2 years before that, and Head and Slocum is still there, and Barker's still there. Same. The road doesn't show as well, but it's there. William W. Gifford, by the way, shows up. His wife is a sister of Sarah Barker, who comes into play in one of the deeds. So don't worry about all these names.
That's 300 Horseneck Road, Bob. That house is still there.
This one?
Yeah.
Okay, that's 300.
Yeah.
Okay, that gives us a little focus. Okay, next slide, please. Now here's the oldest one we have here. And you notice there's a house on both sides of the road here, both called S. Barker. There's a Samuel Barker and there's a Stephen Barker, his father. I don't know which is which here, if they're both Samuel or both Stephen. But they did some land selling, conveying, and they were talking about 300 acres. So it's a significant amount of land. And I'll show you some more data we have. And Head and Durfee are up here now. Next slide, please. Okay, now this is a little bit of an overview of what I believe is true about the house at 197. I believe that Jabez Barker, the son of Jabez who had the sawmill on Chase Road near Lucy Little, that he got married around 1747 to a woman from Tiverton. And I believe at about that time they built the house. So I think the house is about that old. I don't have any real evidence for that, okay? Don't jump. The only evidence we have about the age of the house is Linda DeRoche, who is pretty much an expert on aging houses, has walked through the house and said it's approximately that age. Stephen Barker and Samuel Barker are from the Plymouth Colony Barkers. Stephen's the son of Jabez, and this is the line, the Barker line. And they got down to this guy, Charles White Barker. He inherited the property and sold it to a guy named Paul Barker, who's not related to the rest of the Barkers. Paul Barker's from Rhode Island, and we'll talk more about him later on. We don't know who Paul Barker sold it to, but shortly after Paul Barker died, leaving 14 children and a widow, Edward Sutton Lawrence, grandfather of a lady sitting here, two ladies sitting here in the front row, bought the house. And he died fairly young at age 43, leaving 8 children. I just was corrected. 7 living at the time. One had died earlier. And to his widow, Helen Almy Smith Lawrence, whose father was Frank Smith. And I believe Myron, your father, later owned it. And after that, I'm not sure, but I know another Lawrence had it. I'm not sure the name, which Lawrence it was, but I remember when Myron Lawrence owned it, because I lived in Westport for a short period. We used to come by that place. My father was approximately similar age, born in '03, and he knew Myron Lawrence. And he had a Hudson dealership there and a garage and so forth. Next slide, please. Don't try to memorize this. There will not be any tests, okay? But there was a lot of names here, and I was told that it gets confusing and not everybody wants to know about all the names. But it's kind of important to have some idea who's related to whom and how they're related. And in this story, a very key figure is James Reed. And James Reed's mother was a Gidley, Judith Gidley, and she was the daughter of Jeremiah Gidley. And you'll see that the name Jeremiah comes through. Some of the kids got named Jeremiah Reed and so forth and so on. It was common kind of a thing. His wife was a Mosier. He had a sawmill somewhere in the village. And he had several children, one of whom was Judith. And she married William Corey Reed. You've seen that name before. He was on the map. And William Corey Reed married Judith Gidley and had several children, one of whom was James Reed, who married Sylvia Francis. And he also married Reynolds, which I'm not sure if I show her here, but if I don't, it's okay. He married her anyway. We'll talk about that later. He had a sister, Susan, who married a whaler named Asa Stevens. And Asa Stevens was from Maine. He went out to sea many times, first time as a green hand. He shows up on the Whaling Museum crew database with a documentary, what ship he was on, what position he held, and so forth. And he started out as a green hand and became a first mate and shipped about 3 or 4 voyages, and then that was it. Didn't show up again. His wife shows up as a widow on a census record. So we know what happened to him. He never came back from the voyage. We don't know if he's in Hawaii with a big family or what, but those things did happen, of course. James Reed had, his Sylvia Francis, one of his wives, and he had 2 children by Sylvia who died at age 30, and Hannah and Sylvia, the name got passed. Sylvia married Emmanuel Mosier, and her sister married a Mosier, and so forth. Okay, next slide, please. One thing I should have told you, James Reed's brother, Jeremiah Reed, his younger brother, married a sister of James's second wife, a Reynolds girl. Okay, I don't know the rest of the family, but now another kinship. We call these kinship groups. They're all kind of related, and you know what the story is. One day there's going to be a wedding. We'll all be related. You know, you've heard that story before, right? I found an error at the last minute, so I changed it. This is Edward S. Lawrence, not William Corey Lawrence. I had William Corey on him. Even I get confused in all this stuff. But this is the Smith-Lawrence group. Some of the people in the room are here on the chart. The children of Myron Lawrence and Helen Rogers. Myron is one of the children of Helen Almy Smith and William Corey and Edward S. Lawrence. And Edward is the guy that died at age 43, leaving the 7 children. And he was Mrs. Lawrence, Helen, was in the line of White family here. Charles White, Carolyn White, married a Smith, and she was Helen Almy Smith. So that's enough for who's who. You don't have to memorize that, but it might help you as we go forward. Next slide, please.
Bob, what's the significance of the stars on a couple of those names?
It's just the fact that they're the ones that associated with the house.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, now some of you are aware that there was a tax imposed called a direct tax, and it was based on real estate values, and it was done in 1798, and somebody up in Boston saved a bunch of these things from the trash, and this is for Dartmouth, and this gives us a clue about what was going on in Dartmouth with people named Barker in 1798. Kind of an important clue for what we're talking about. Stephen Barker and Samuel Barker, the two S. Barker guys that we showed on the map. Stephen is the older, Stephen's the father, and Samuel's the son. And I think Jabez Barker that's J. Burr here, mistyped, not mine, in the original record, I believe. And I think this is a grandson, father, and grandfather. Now Jabez is the guy with all the money. The value of his holdings, even though he had only 1.5 houses, was $1,360. Stephen Barker, who I think this house belonged to at one time, had 3 houses in 1798. And remember we saw 2 S. Barker houses on the map? And I know there's a picture, Worth has a picture of one of the S. Barker houses. That the house is gone. And I think it was on the east side of the road. Richard, do you know?
That house was on the west side of the road, the old Holder Slocum house.
Okay, so that's gone, right? Excuse me. I think that's one of these 3 houses. Anyway, that's 1798. Now we're going to kind of stay sequential. Next slide. Just don't read all this. I'm not going to read all this. Paul Maxon Barker is the guy from Rhode Island, and he's an old Rhode Island name that his family goes back to the 1600s. None of them are connected with the Plymouth colony, but a lot of names you'll recognize: Peckhams and Wilcoxes and so on. I mean, Westport and Dartmouth were all populated by people from the island. Lots of people from the island. Okay, next slide. Okay, in the 1880 census of Dartmouth, this guy Paul Barker that we're talking about, from Rhode Island, lived he had houses both Rhode Island and here, and he had 15 children. So I don't know if he had 2 wives. I think he only had 1 wife, and her name was Ruth Brown. As a matter of fact, he died, later on we'll see he died and left her with 14 of those kids. But this is an actual handwritten census enumeration in 1880. And that's Paul, 55, and a son and a daughter. And he had a daughter keeping house and a son helping him farm the farm over here. And he also had a farm over in Rhode Island. Next slide, please. Now, one of the tragic things in 1884, just 4 years after that census record, one of his kids was an adult named Eugene Barker, was murdered. And there's a little newspaper article from the Boston Globe, and it says that he was a popular guy. There was a big to-do about this in Newport area, and this so big a do they had a little piece in the paper. 2,000 people attended his grave, visited his grave. There's some kind of a scene with some adultery and all kind of real juicy stuff. Which we'll save that for another time. Next slide, please. Just to give you an idea that we do know Paul's family, those are his kids. We have dates and who they married and all kinds of stuff. Not that we're going to bore you with all that stuff, but that's, and he left that family when he died. And he died in Dartmouth. Next slide, please. Presumably in that house. In 1850, the family of William C. Reed, that's William Corey Reed, was living somewhere in Dartmouth. I think he was in later times. It showed him as like a tenant farmer for the Barkers, and I see him buying. I see his son James buying land, but no buildings, north of the Samuel Barker house. And so, and that land gets transferred in the family, and I believe that the house was right there on the edge of the land he owned, and he was probably paying rent or farming the land for the guy or doing something. I can't prove it yet, but okay. In 1852, James bought for $125 a woodlot, which his mother Judith Gidley inherited from her father Jeremiah. It was 7 acres and 85 rods. James is 20. They're getting him ready to get married. This is what they did in those days. We'll get you some land, da-da, da-da. Okay? This is, and notice this little lot stays as kind of the identity of what gets transferred down through the ages. Okay, next slide, please. In 1852, a guy named Howard Potter and his wife Elizabeth, he was the grave digger at the Pontegansett meeting grounds. Judy talked about him. I'm quite sure it's the same guy, but maybe not. Sold James Reed for $201. How'd you like to get land in Dartmouth for this price? 6 acres and 112 rods, joining the Samuel Barker farm. So the story starts to come together with these pieces of the puzzle. In 1855, this is the state census. By the way, I'm giving you the documentary reference. This is Bristol County Land Records, book 37, pages 499 and 500. We actually have the deed if you'd like to read the deed. I extracted the deed to give you this information. And this is in the Dartmouth Vital Records for marriages in 1854. That's where I got that information. There's a Massachusetts state census in 1855. Every half decade, they did state censuses for a while. James Reed, 24 years old, a farmer, was living with his wife Sylvia W. Reed. Remember, her maiden name was Frances, living in Dartmouth. And I said, see neighbors. I didn't show you the neighbors, but we have all the neighbors. It's all the people we know about, the Barkers and the Heads and so forth and so forth. Okay, next slide, please. We're going to take a little while going through some of this detail, but we're going to come out the other side. You'll understand a lot more than you do now. Okay, 1856. We're doing a timeline, if you will. 1856. James Reed's sister Hannah E. Reed died at age 13 and 9 months of scrofula. Anybody know what scrofula is? Anybody? Kind of a tuberculosis-like thing. Susan, is that? They don't call it that anymore, do they? No. I see many references to that, but I'm pretty sure it's a lung issue of some kind. In 1857, his other sister, Susan, was 19 years old, and she got married to this guy, Asa Stevens, whose name is spelt in the records both P-H-E and S-T-E-V. Don't go by spelling and records, because many people have to handle that stuff, and it gets misspelled many times. I'll find a pocket here somewhere. Asa Stevens was a mariner from Gardner, Maine, and I got that for the marriage, Vital Records for Marriages. In 1857, the same year he got married, by the way, he ships out on the ship Ohio II as a first mate. He had shipped earlier. I didn't show you when he shipped earlier, but I have the records. He started out as a green hand, and he shipped on different ships, not always the same. Some were barks, some were ships, and so forth. Next slide, please. In 1860 census, James Reed shows up as a 28-year-old farmhand with his wife Sylvia, who's 26, and a little girl, Hannah, age 1, in Dartmouth, near Benjamin Head and Samuel Barker. Note also that James's father, Corey, going by his middle name now, not his first name, but that's him, okay, was listed in the Samuel Barker household as a farmhand. So he's living in the, he's shown in the household, counted, which means he's living in that house. Okay. Generally, it means that. Okay, in 1860, Asa Stevens, a seaman, 29, born in Maine. Personal estate, PE, personal estate worth $500. And his wife Susan, 24, born in Mass, living in Dartmouth. So their household, they had a household. He had a little money. He was a whaler. He got paid as a first mate. They made good money in those days. Okay. In 1861, he shipped out again on a bark, the John Wells, as the first mate. And I got that from the Bedford Whaling Crew database. This was his last voyage. Next slide. Okay, one of the things we collect data from is the agricultural census. This is an 1860 agricultural census. And this is Stephen Barker. And you can't read all that stuff. I had a hard time reading that even when I could blow it up. So I read it for you and wrote it down. The number of acres of improved land in his farm, 70 acres. Unimproved land, I guess a woodlot maybe, 20 acres. Cash value of the farm, $5,300. In 1860, that's probably a lot of dough. Value of the farming machinery, 158, I missed the dollar sign. The livestock he had on the farm, 1 horse, 5 milk cows, 2 working oxen, 3 other cattle, probably beef cows or something, 12 sheep, 2 swine. The value of livestock, $475. Year's produce, 150 bushels of Indian corn, 150 bushels of oats, 60 pounds of wool. Next slide, please. 75 bushels of Irish potatoes, 50 bushels of barley. Value of produce from the market garden, $40. 25 tons of hay. And the value of animals slaughtered, $85. So to give you an idea of what was going on down there at that time. Okay, next slide, please. In 1861, this is a deed that has to do with the Gidleys, and it very often in land records you learn a lot about genealogy. This is one of those deeds that tells you who's related to whom and who was living at the time of the deed, because they signed the deed. They all signed, and this is all the Gidleys and the cousins and their wives and spouses and so forth. I'm not going to read it all, but you'll notice that Asa is here, Asa Stevens, right here. See, Susan Stevens, wife of Asa. Charles, Jerusha Ann Jones, wife of Charles Jones, and Sylvia Reed, wife of James. Okay, next slide. Oh, one thing, back one. This is an interesting deed because it refers to the lot of land that Jeremiah Gidley owned on the road from Russell's Mills to Cuff's Corner. I referred to a couple of my reference resources. Cuff's Corner is up at the corner of Fisher Road and Old Westport Road, where Paul Cuffey owned property. And that's Fisher Road. Fisher Road goes, yes.
I think Jeremiah Gidley's house was the one where Leona and John Ashton lived.
Okay, good. Leona Ashton, right, Ashton, yes.
Are they mentioning grand tours because this is a quit claim deed?
These are all different kind of deeds. I didn't record whether they're warranty deeds or quit claim deeds or mortgage deeds. Some of them, I do refer to some mortgage deeds later on. But I don't get into that too much. I'm really interested in the information, not the financial side of it, the legal side. Next slide, please. In 1863, James Reed was listed on a list of people subject to military duty. 1863, guess what was happening in 1863? Civil War, right? In the remarks column, besides giving his name, they said he's an asthmatic. So among other things, poor old James Reed was asthmatic, trying to raise work a farm and being an asthmatic. In 1864, a year after that, his first wife, Sylvia Frances Reed, died. And at age 30, we calculate her age from the date of death and her age, her birth date. And this is from the database called Find a Grave for the Upon-Agansett Friends Cemetery. So obviously, they're probably friends. They're buried in that cemetery. Maybe not, but 1865, the state census, he shows up as a widower. She died, that makes sense, right? With children, Hannah, 6, and Sylvia, 4. She died, leaving him with those 2 little girls that they had. So another one of the effects of things that happened. He had a real doleful life, I'm sure. His sister was living with him. She was a widow. This is how we knew Asa was lost. If he wasn't lost, he didn't come back, and they declared him lost, making up the household. And again, the neighbors were Benjamin Head. And we'll note that this, put together with other information we have, that Asa Stevens died. This is how you get clues, and you make the story up from the clues, the facts, the deduction. That he died between 25 January 1861, when he signed the conveyance with the other heirs of Jeremiah Gidley, and 22 June 1865, when Susan was declared a widow when they took the census. So that's how you get a date for Asa Stevens' death. Okay, next slide. In 1865, James married his second wife. And you'll note that they picked a young girl this time, 21, he's 34. She was the daughter of David B. and Elizabeth Reynolds, and a sister of his brother Jeremiah's wife, Ruth Reynolds. In 1870, the U.S. Census tells us that James Reed now owns some real estate. And we know he owns real estate from, we have some deeds where he bought some land. That we have some transfers. It's worth, according to the census taker, $600. He's 38, Mary's 24, and he's got his children. Now Hannah is 10 and Sylvia is 5, children of his first wife. And he's got neighbors. Corey, that's his father, who has a wife, Sarah. That's not Judith Gidley anymore. Judith must have died or taken off or something, because he's got another wife. Now, Corey's fairly old, 62 in those days, that's fairly old. And another neighbor is Prince Allen. This is the 1870 census. Okay, in 1871, J. Reed is indicated on the map of Dartmouth. Now, it shows with a house, so if he owned a house, it's one thing. We know he owned land, so it's unclear to me yet what's going on about the houses. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, also in 1870 census, in Dartmouth, here's Paul Barker. Remember good old Paul Barker, the guy that died after this, he died, leaving 14 kids, had a house in Middletown and a house in Dartmouth. Here he is in Dartmouth, and his, I don't know how many of his kids, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 kids. And this is the next house, Otis Slocum. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, we're almost through this tedious part, and then we'll get into some other stuff. In 1896, we're getting later on. A stillborn baby boy was born to Sylvia Reed and Emmanuel Mosier. Sylvia Reed is James Reed's daughter. So this is his grandson that died in February 1896. In May of the same year, at age 50, his wife Mary, 13 years younger than him, died from cancer in Dartmouth, all documented. And in June of that same year, June 28th, death by suicide, hanging in the barn. James A. Reed, twice a widower, age 64 and 11 days. Next slide, please. So this is the tragic kind of thing that sometimes comes out of looking at documents and learning the real history of what went on. This is how it was recorded in the town vital records that we have online. This is a handwritten record, and his Mary Reynolds Reed, wife of James A. Reed, female, married, 50 years and 11 months old, cancer, cause of death. Here's James Reed, and the dates are over here where I didn't record the dates. I had the dates on the other one, right? James Reed, James A. Reed, male, white, 64 years and 11 months, suicide by hanging. So this is the extent of the record. Next slide, please. Soon after that death, the two girls, Hannah and Sylvia, for $1 and other valuable considerations, a common way to convey land to a friend. Sometimes there was a secret deal, or sometimes it was just for love and affection or other reasons, payment. 2 tracts or parcels of land in Dartmouth, recognize these. 7 acres and 24 rods, more or less, and the other, the same as conveyed by James Reed by William C. Reed. The second, abutting S. Barker's land, being the premises conveyed by Howard Potter to James Reed, 6 acres, 112 rods. You remember those, right? Okay, next slide, please. This is the gravestone in the Upon-a-Gansett meeting, and this is the date he died, June 28th, 18, that's right there. And he was born in 1831. Okay, next slide, please. And this is the newspaper article in one of the Boston papers. The newspapers sometimes get some of the facts wrong. All right, if you read that, you see that it says about a year ago Reed's wife died. No, it was just a month. It was just about a month between her death and his suicide. He lost a grandson, a stillborn grandson, and he lost his wife, second wife, leaving him with those little girls. They weren't as little anymore as they were when his first wife died, but he still had to deal with it. And too much for him to deal with. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, I have all this on a printed thing, and I'm not. You've seen most of this stuff. I'm just going to whip through it. If you want to glance at it, just go next page, please. This is the early life. This is something you can do with the Family Tree Maker. It's called.
Was James Reed buried in Upon-a-Gansett?
Yes, he is.
I wasn't sure if
Yeah.
they allowed
Suicide.
suicide to be buried. You know, the
Friends
Catholics
do,
don't.
friends do, other
I didn't know if they always
mainstream
had.
Christian
Yep,
communities
yep.
do.
Yeah.
That's my.
Or didn't, I don't know about that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, one of the things I'm not going to dwell on this, but if you deal with Family Tree Maker, the software package that do stuff, you can create things like this very easily. And sometime maybe we'll have a little workshop and I'll show you how to do it. It creates a nice summary, what they call timeline, and I've got many events in his life, and I amplify. And I have footnotes for all. I have footnotes for all of them. I gave them to you already, right? Next slide, please. This is when his daughter was born, and the dates and where it was, and his family unit as defined in the census. So you can create events. You don't have to use all the events Family Tree Maker provides. You can create your own. And so that's what I call the family unit. Then I give it a date, and you pull off the census. And so forth. Next slide, please. Likewise, grantor of real estate, grantor and a grantee, you all know the difference, right? Grantor is selling, grantee is buying or receiving, giving and receiving. And so you got military census, spouse's death, first wife's death, family unit again, marriage, Mary Reynolds, and I can put in a note, researcher's note, that she was Mary Reynolds was 13 years James's junior. Next slide, please. And again, his brother got married. I can tell you that. As an event in his life, his brother got married. Family unit in 1870. Each census gives you the family unit. Location of his residence, I created that one. It's J. Reed on the Beers map of Dartmouth. Family unit in 1880. His daughter marries. I created any of these in caps, I created. This is created by Family Tree Maker. Next slide, please. Okay, his daughter Sylvia, his younger daughter, get married. His grandchild was born. His grandchild died the same day, still born. He died, and his lots, no house mentioned. His lots were sold by his daughters to some other Mosier. And I don't know who this Mary and Frederick Mosier were. If anybody knows them, I'd appreciate it because they're probably connected. The Jeremiah Gidley's wife was a Mosier, and there are a lot of Mosiers in Dartmouth, tons of Mosiers, and tons of Gidleys, and tons of Smiths, and tons of Lawrences, and tons of everybody. People like Dartmouth, they stick around. Next slide, please. Okay, now, in 1897, we're going to move on a little bit. We're moving on to the Lawrence family. Helen Almy Smith, daughter of Frank and Caroline White Smith, married Edward Sutton Lawrence. She was 19, he was 29. He was a farmer, she was at home. His father and mother were Abraham and Elizabeth Allen. Abraham Lawrence and Elizabeth Allen. So this is the beginning of a life of another family that we know lived in the house. Okay, next slide. This is Edward Sutton Lawrence, grandfather of these two ladies in the front row. And that's quite a nice picture. I found that on the internet. I didn't get it from the family. If you've seen it, I'm sure.
I was going to bring it, but I
Oh, you were going to bring it. You have it. Good.
do.
Good. It's a beautiful picture. Okay, next slide. And this is his wife. And she's the lady who brought up all those children alone. So you talk about heavy-duty stuff. This is heavy-duty stuff. Helen Almy Smith, you can see she had a pretty nice disposition just by the look on her face. As a matter of fact, her granddaughter looks quite a lot like her, if you take a good look. Next slide, please. And this is her father, Helen's father, Frank Smith. And I think he's buried in the other Quaker lot where Bernie is, down in, yeah, I'm quite sure. Right, the Lawrences are buried at Helen's Neck. Next slide, please. Okay, now, another occurrence that I think is related to the house. Mr. Paul Barker, remember he's a Rhode Islander. He died at his home in Dartmouth, Mass. I think that's the house. On Wednesday, after a long and painful illness, leaves a widow and 14 children. Funeral service will be held at his son's residence in Gibb Street. This is Newport paper. After which remains will be taken to Middletown for interment. Father of 14 children. Next slide, please. Helen Almy Smith, 19, that's the marriage record, we already get that. And the conveyance of the land that the Reed sisters had sold to Mary and Frederick Mosier, and the Reed sisters conveyed the land to Edward S. Lawrence, the grandfather of these ladies. One of butter mentioned in the deed, the S. Barker farm. So my theory that the house was where they lived, the land is right there against the house. Okay, next slide, please. 1900, U.S. Census. This is Sherman Mosier, 61, and wife Hannah Mosier. Hannah is the daughter of James Reed, with a baby son, Howard, age 1. In 1908, 8 years later, Sherman Mosier, the father, they were living in Westport, by the way, he died from diabetes, right there. That's when the Westport Vital Records, deaths of 1908. 1908, July 14th, death by suicide, chloroform poisoning. Hannah E. Reed Mosier, aged 49 years, 1 month, 2 days, widow, daughter of James Reed and Sylvia Francis in Westport. 2 generations of Suicides. Interesting, interesting. One of the things I don't, yes, ma'am.
No, I just want to add this because I just read it. I'm trying to think how to define this. Data and analysis of that data suggests that suicide is the worst possible cataclysmic event that can happen in a family.
Yeah.
More so, and I thought about this, I said, well, you know, there are other bad things. that can
Oh yeah,
happen in a
lots of
family.
bad things,
Lots of
fires,
bad
all
things.
kinds of stuff.
And they said in terms of long-term outcomes, suicide's the worst.
Yeah, yeah. It turns out, I had heard about other suicides in the area in that time period. So I didn't do a big deep study.
Yeah,
I just did a very cursory. I made a phone call, and then I did a little bit of work, and I found 3 other suicides in Russell's Mills. One about 4 years before James Reed's. You know, I think what's coming to me, if you want to be theoretical, I'm not a psychiatrist or anything, trust me, but great loss and example.
yeah.
And I'd like to know more. I really would like to know more because it would be nice to be able to do something to prevent people who are down and feeling bad from doing such a tragic thing.
I don't know, you people all know a lot more about this than I do, but one of the things they always say is, you know, if you have connections, if you have interactions, if you have, and these all seem to be people deeply embedded in the community.
Connected, right.
Yeah,
Right.
lots of connections. So,
That may
shocking.
influence the degree of loss they feel.
Well, that could,
If they're that much connected and someone they're very close to dies, or suddenly maybe the cancer might have been a quick thing. I don't know. I really don't know. It's one of those open questions. Yes.
One thing that usually happens too, a lot of fishermen you see, I saw you mentioned one up there, you see lost at sea even today, most of them jump over.
I'm not hearing very well.
There's a lot of suicides out that are fishermen,
Yes.
they'll just jump over.
Yeah. Yeah.
They'll
Oh
say-
yeah.
I know the last one was a friend of mine, and his father jumped over too years
Yeah.
ago. This guy jumped
Oh, that
over
example in the
just-
family. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah.
And you
Pretty-
see, nobody, like, they never put that in the newspaper, that sort of,
Oh yeah. A lot of this hush hush. I mean, a lot of these things never get mentioned. You know. I mean, in my family, I can go back and listen. You know, I'd come home on a Christmas Eve or something, and my grandmother and my mother and my aunt would be there crying their eyes out. And I wouldn't get any explanation when I was a kid. Later on, I learned, I'm pretty observant, and I learned what it was, but pretty serious stuff. Okay, next slide, please. This is the actual death certificate for the chloroform poisoning. So I'm not making this stuff up. These are all documented facts in the public record. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, and in 1909, grandfather Lawrence died at a young age 43, from abscess of liver and uremia, leaving a widow and 7 children. Another child had died previous to that, I'm told tonight. And this is in Dartmouth Vital Records. Okay, next slide, please. There he is again. You saw him before, but I thought I'd show him again. Okay, next slide. Okay, I'm really running a little late, but I won't be much longer. I really wanted to finish this stuff up. I apologize for being so windy, but I haven't read every word, but I've talked a lot. One of the best resources we have about learning about genealogy and history is real estate, is the deeds. And you can find a lot of the old deeds online at a place called FamilySearch.org. Tremendous resource done by the Mormons. Accordingly, I've used that, and when I combine what I learned from the deeds with all this other stuff from those census and vital records and the list of Civil War qualified people, etc., and so on, you can make quite a story up and have a lot of the facts. A table showing the abstracts of these deeds is attached. We're not going to go through that, but I'll show you what I have in the format I have. I'll post it. So if you want to study it, you can study it. And we'll have this whole thing up on the website. Next slide, please. Our strongest evidence so far about this house is the combination of the 1871 map and the 1895 map and the statement by the granddaughter of Edward Lawrence, who purchased the property in 1900 from Mary M. and Frederick Mosier, purchased the land and lived in the, and we know he lived in the house, so he might have purchased the building in another deed that I don't have, which is a very real possibility. Because if you recall in the map, Paul Parker was written down on the map, and his name is really Barker. But if the map maker got it wrong, maybe the people who did the deeds got it wrong, and I got to go look for Paul Parker as a grantor to Edward Lawrence, and I might find the answer. But I got a few deeds to collect. Okay, and next slide, please. This is what the extracts look like. And I summarize all the dates. You notice on deeds there are 3 dates. The date they did the deed, the date they attested that it was their free will before some authority, and the date it was recorded. And those 3 dates aren't always the same day. Sometimes there's years between some of them, and sometimes that tells you something. So I got all the dates, the grantor's name, and a little description of the grantor. You know, like Yeoman of Dartmouth, the last of New Bedford. No, never mind that. Both of Dartmouth over here. Being the same conveyed to me, this is a description of the property, and so forth. These are all short versions of what's in the deed. It's an extract, and the deeds, sometimes I have lists, and the book and page is the reference. You want to read the whole thing? Go to the book and page. I have the whole thing if you want it. It's not easy to read, and it takes a lot of space. I couldn't possibly put it up here and drive you nuts. This drives you nuts right now. I can tell by looking at you. Okay, next slide. Okay, 1865. Now we got a few deeds, a few bigger extracts of deeds. Charles W. Barker. He's the son of Samuel Barker, the son of Stephen Barker, the son of Jabez Barker, the son of Jabez Barker, the son of Isaac Barker, whose wife was a prince. Governor Prince was a governor of Plymouth Colony. If you think the Barkers of Dartmouth were substantial people, they were descended from the governor of Plymouth Colony. And it's no wonder they had a lot of land, 300 acres down on Horse Neck Road, etc. And there are lots of them, a lot of Barkers around from Plymouth Colony. Okay, he bought from his sister Sarah Gifford and her husband William Gifford for $3,300, one undivided half part with a land and dwelling house with other buildings about 1 mile southerly from Russell's Mills Village, homestead of Samuel Barker, deceased. That says it, right? That's S. Barker on the map. It also mentions 300 acres someplace that I didn't write down. And the same basic book and page, book 54, 449, and 50, it starts on 449 and finishes on 50. He also bought from his mother all the rights, titles, and interests which she has in the land with the dwelling house and other buildings thereon situated. Homestead farm of the late Samuel Barker. Next slide, please. 65 also, he mortgages all of that for $4,400. So he bought it with a mortgage, right? He eventually paid off the mortgage. You'll see how in a few minutes. In 1867, 2 years later, he sold it to Paul Barker of Middletown. Okay? Paul Barker himself got a mortgage from James A. Tripp for $2,000. He had some money, I guess, and he didn't have to mortgage all of it. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, I'm somewhat of an academic historically, so I always try to give a little reference to the shorthand. These are my shorthand references, and these are what they stand for. The 1850 U.S. Census is obvious. Most of these are obvious. The 55 1865 mass state census. You probably know about state censuses anyway. The map of Dartmouth, the 1895 map of Dartmouth, that's the Everts and Richards map found on our website. Next slide, please. This reference is a little more confusing. BCLR is the Bristol County Land Records. BBB is the book number, and the PPP-PPP are the page numbers over which it writes, okay? Boston Herald, that's obvious. Civil War registrations. Deaths in the Dartmouth Vital Records. DVR, Dartmouth Vital Records. Find a grave in a certain graveyard. AAA is the graveyard. And there's a website to find a grave. New Bedford Whaling Museum crew database, that's found at this website. Private communication that I had with Cynthia on January, I guess that the date. Don't tell anybody. And the Westport Vital Records. Next slide. Any questions? Bernie?
So Bob, some of the early maps you show
Yeah,
appear not to show this house. So if you consider that the house is moved,
it's a possibility.
and it was a very common occurrence back then.
Yes, it was.
So you might look at those maps again, the ones that appear not to show it, because in my opinion, it'd be odd not to show it because it's so close to the road.
Yeah,
So it should appear.
yeah,
So it may, that house, even though, and I agree that that's an earlier house than the maps show it not there.
yeah,
So that's why I'm saying it's not built later, but it may well have been moved.
right.
After
Right.
Mr. Reed bought the property.
One of the clues that I have latched onto is that the land, those two lots that kept getting with no building, and when you look on the tax map, today's tax map, so there's some land boundaries, and there's a little narrow piece of land that comes to the street where the house is. And a big piece of land in the back and balloon like a big balloon. So you could sort of envision the fact that somebody bought the land right next to the house. He might have been living in the house when he bought the land, paying rent or being a farmhand or something, or whatever, I don't know. Or I may have a deed I haven't found yet, because the transfer between Paul Barker, after he, or his estate, and it shows us P. Parker Estate on one of the maps after he died. I suspect one of those 14 kids probably was the grantor of the land for the estate to the Lawrences. And I haven't found that map, that deed yet. Maybe it doesn't exist. You know, sometimes they miss them, I'm sure.
Because the Barker house, the big house we're talking about,
Yeah.
the Dutch Cap house,
Right.
that was a huge house.
Yes.
So you could have 14 kids there.
Yeah, and there's a picture of that house, right? That doesn't
Oh, yeah,
worth.
That house disappeared in the late 70s, I think.
Yeah.
It was, by the way, it was reported, it burned to the ground, it was reported as a fire by a flying airplane going by. Nobody in, it was middle of the night on Horseneck Road, nobody saw it.
Wow.
And somebody landing at New Bedford Airport reported the
Okay.
fire.
Talk about a series of tragedies.
Yeah.
Well, that was, nobody lived there, had lived there for a long time.
Yeah, yeah, okay. Okay, well, thank you for your attention, George.
Bob, that was a long journey, but could you take us back to the beginning?